Hello and welcome to the weekly podcast from the Huffines Institute for Sports Medicine and Human Performance. I'm your host, Dr. Tim Lightfoot, and I'm so glad that you took the time to join us today as we have this special podcast. Now, as you know, during the pandemic, we haven't done as many podcasts as we've done in the past, and part of that is because of the seriousness of what we're all going through. But where we've been able to do podcasts is how exercise relates to the pandemic. And I would encourage you to check out our previous podcasts that talk about exercise during the pandemic, when you can safely exercise, when you shouldn't, and a variety of other guidelines that we have posted and that are posted on a national basis. And today we're going to continue that series of talking about exercise and health, particularly health during the time of a pandemic. And I'm very pleased to have with us today a guest, an esteemed guest, from other parts of my campus, which I'll give you a little introduction today. We're going to talk about vaccine hesitancy today, and our guest is Dr. Tim Callaghan. So Dr. Callaghan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you here, and we're so excited to introduce you to the audience and let them know a little bit more about you. And I'll give you a little introduction, and then we'll just jump right in to the podcast. Now, Dr. Callaghan is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Texas A&M School of Public Health. He's been here at A&M since 2016. He got a Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science and a Bachelor of Science in Biological Sciences from the University of Connecticut. So he got 2 bachelor's degrees, right? Might as well make the most of your time, right? He then got his Master's of Art and Doctor of Philosophy in Political Science from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. He is multi-awarded over the years. His most recent award is the Dale S. Wright Best Paper Award. That was given to him at the 2019 meeting of the American Political Science Association. He's been asked to do many guest lectures. Given his topic of research, he's been asked to be on a lot of different TV shows and radio shows, many of which you would recognize if we named them, including ABC News. And so we're quite pleased to have someone with his expertise in this topic here talking with us today. And again, our topic is vaccine hesitancy. So, Dr. Callaghan, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let's just start with a kind of basic definition of what is this thing you're calling vaccine hesitancy?
Right. So vaccine hesitancy is the reluctance or the refusal to vaccinate despite the availability of vaccination services. And when we think about vaccine hesitancy, the important thing to recognize is that it's a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, you have individuals who will accept any vaccine that is given to them by their physician, whether it's the flu vaccine, the shingles vaccine, the HPV vaccine, whatever might be appropriate. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have individuals who refuse vaccines under all circumstances. And the reality is that most Americans are somewhere in between. They'll accept vaccines under some circumstances and won't accept vaccines under other circumstances. And what I do and what I study is trying to understand who's going to accept vaccines when, and also how can we convince individuals who are reluctant to vaccinate to move forward towards vaccinating.
So what are some of the underlying reasons why people wouldn't get vaccinated? And let's keep it topical. Let's stay with the COVID vaccination. I mean, I've had several individuals that tell me that they were not going to get vaccinated for a variety of reasons. And every time I push back, there seems to be there's not really a real solid reason. It's kind of nebulous. But so in your research, what have you found? What are the general reasons why people don't want to get vaccinated?
Yeah, so there's sort of 2 different sets of reasons. The simplest reasons are access reasons, right? If getting access to the vaccine is difficult for one reason or another because you don't have access to transportation, you can't get time off from work, the location of the vaccination site is inconvenient, whatever it might be, access can be a reason why individuals choose not to vaccinate. And that's true both of non-COVID-19 vaccines as well as the COVID vaccine, right? One of the reasons why employers are so keen on doing flu vaccination clinics at the office and places like that is they're trying to make it as easy for you to access as possible, right? So access can be a huge barrier. Now, in the context of COVID-19, my research, as well as the research of others, suggests an additional set of reasons why individuals are choosing not to vaccinate. The 2 most common reasons individuals have chosen not to vaccinate is because they are concerned about the potential safety and potential effectiveness of the COVID-19 vaccines. Some people are concerned that the vaccine development process happened incredibly quickly, that there's brand new technologies being used for the Pfizer Moderna vaccines, the use of these mRNA-based technologies. And for others, it's just a reticence to say, how do we know that these vaccines are truly safe and that these vaccines are going to work in the short term and the long term? So some people are concerned safety and efficacy. In addition, there's another group of individuals who have chosen not to vaccinate because of what I would deem conspiracy theories, right? The endorsement of ideas, for example, that the vaccine is going to contain some sort of microchip, that the vaccine is funded by Bill Gates or a variety of other nebulous actors out there and is unsafe and something that you should not participate in, right? So there's a non-trivial portion of the public that has conspiratorial beliefs related to vaccination in general and the COVID-19 vaccine in particular. And then there's two other reasons. One is financial resources. There's actually a non-trivial portion of the public who has chosen not to vaccinate because they lack the financial resources or the health insurance that they believe they need to get vaccinated, not realizing that vaccination is actually free and easily accessible for most Americans. They just hold misperceptions about that. And then the final reason that some individuals have chosen not to vaccinate is because they believe that they've already had COVID-19, and why would they need to be vaccinated if they've already had the virus? Now, there are very good reasons why you should get vaccinated, even if you've had COVID-19, but nonetheless, some Americans are choosing not to vaccinate because they've already had the virus. So those are the main reasons that the literature and my research points to.
So, of those reasons, are there any that are on good scientific foundation? I mean, when people say some of these things to me, I push back and say, well, tell me your rationale. Where is that? And as I said, often it's nebulous. I read this, or I saw this, or my friend told me this. But of all the things that you just said, are there any of those that are on good foundational grounds, good reason for people to refuse the vaccine?
No, not really. For many of them, it's just the outright endorsement of conspiratorial beliefs or various pieces of misinformation. The ones that are probably closest to the mark of having just a grain of truth would be the concerns related to how quickly the vaccines were developed, or potentially how long we know these vaccines are going to work, right? The reality is, yes, it was an incredibly fast vaccine development process compared to what is normal. However, that does not mean that the vaccine is any less safe. It still went through all of the safety steps we would traditionally want. In addition, on the effectiveness side, as a new vaccine that's only now being given to people, we don't know what this vaccine will do in 5 years or 10 years, or how long the protection will last. So there is a grain of truth there. But the fundamental reality we need to recognize is, even with those caveats, it is still incredibly safe. It is still incredibly effective and provides considerably more protection than the alternative, which is not vaccinating and being at risk of getting the virus.
So, as we are faced with people saying these kinds of things to us, how do we educate folks otherwise? Because you and I both know that sometimes the way to persuade people is not to look at them and say, no, you're wrong. That's not the way it is. How do we educate people to help move them towards or away from vaccine hesitancy?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to recognize is exactly what you just said. Telling people that they're wrong is almost always the wrong way to go. And there's decades of research in psychology and sociology and political science that tells us that simply telling someone that they're wrong and telling them to listen to something else will almost always backfire, right? If anything, it will immediately turn them off and not want to listen to whatever message you might have, even if you're correct and they're incorrect, right? So the first thing to do is to recognize where someone is and not to dismiss their beliefs out of hand, right? So that's the first step. Now, beyond that, I think there's two things we need to be thinking about. We need to be thinking about messages and messengers, right? From a messenger perspective, we know that individuals are most likely to be convinced and to change their behaviors when they are told things by people that they trust, right? The people that you trust, you're going to listen to far more than anyone else. Now, the research on vaccines would tell us that the most trusted individual quite often is your own personal healthcare provider, right? Whereas many other people in your lives have various motivations and might be self-interested, the goal of your personal physician, above all else, should be to make sure you're safe and healthy. So if they tell you to do something, you tend to trust them and to carry forward with it, which is why when we look at vaccination in general, for example, the HPV vaccine, the impact of having a provider recommend that to the parent and the adolescent is massive, right? So having a physician actually be the ones that say, hey, you really should get this done, can be incredibly effective. But physicians aren't the only effective messenger, right? As long as it's someone you trust in your life, they can be effective. So for some individuals, that's going to be a religious leader, right? For other individuals, it might be a local community leader. It could even be, for some individuals, a political leader, right? If you're a supporter of former President Trump or current President Biden, and you're steadfast in your belief and your support of them, if they tell you you should do this for a particular reason, you might listen to them, right? So that's the first side. It's messengers, and the big thing on the messenger side is trust. Now, the other side of that is messages. And we need to recognize that, there isn't one silver bullet. There's not one message that's going to work for everyone. There's no one size fits all message, and that different messages will be effective for different groups, right? And that just makes sense, because if people are hesitant to vaccinate for different reasons, it naturally makes sense that different messages are going to work for them, right? So if someone is hesitant to vaccinate because they think the speed of the vaccination process went too quickly, well, explaining to them that mRNA-based vaccines and SARS-based vaccines have been in development, since the last SARS outbreak in Toronto, well over a decade ago, that might help to alleviate the sort of sensational rhetoric from these pharmaceutical companies of, we've developed these so quickly. If you're concerned about safety in general, walking an individual through how these vaccines are determined to be safe might be effective, right? If you're planning not to vaccinate because of financial resource constraints, well, you can walk them through how they can get the vaccine free of cost without any worries related to that, right? So it's messages and messengers that combine to be able to convince some individuals, while recognizing that just calling individuals out for being wrong is not the way to go.
And I would like to note that both of the political figures you mentioned have both advocated for vaccinations. So if you follow this on a political standpoint, go get vaccinated anyway.
Right. Yeah. No, what's interesting, though, is that has not always been the case. Right. And as someone who tracks vaccine hesitancy, I've been tracking it since early in the pandemic. And the Pew Research Center has put out some really interesting work on this, tracking vaccine hesitancy among liberals and conservatives over time. And what ended up happening was, during the heat of the presidential campaign, both candidates were saying things that could sow some doubt in vaccination. For example, President Trump regularly was downplaying the severity of the virus, while simultaneously, President Biden and Vice President Harris on the campaign trail were saying that they wouldn't trust a vaccine from the Trump administration. And what happened was, support for vaccination dropped by about 20% among conservatives and liberals in the context of the heat of the campaign. And once Biden became president, support for vaccination went back up for liberals, but it stayed at sort of concerning levels for Republicans.
Since I've opened this door and we've walked through it, so is it still there with conservatives? Because again,
yes,
Trump did come out and say, go get vaccinated, and other prominent conservative leaders have said, get vaccinated.
Yes, it is still there. And this is something people who study vaccines have been worried about for quite a while, because even before the pandemic, we knew that conservatives were more likely to be hesitant to vaccinate than liberals, right? Conservatives tend to be less trusting of science. They tend to be less trusting of the medical establishment. And because of that, over time, regardless of what vaccine you looked at, there tended to be an effect where conservatives would be slightly more vaccine hesitant than liberals. Now, in the context of the pandemic, this was exacerbated because in the early months of the pandemic, the Trump administration was downplaying the severity of the virus. And if you're being told by a political leader you trust that the virus isn't very serious, you might take them at their word and say, well, why would I get vaccinated if it isn't very serious, right? Simultaneously, not just President Trump, but the Trump administration in general, at various times has sort of denigrated science and scientists, right? Calling out Anthony Fauci for changing guidance related to wearing masks and things like that. And if you're already more predisposed to be less trusting of science, and the political leaders that you trust are questioning the scientists who are telling you to get vaccinated, it could lead you to be less trusting of the vaccine and less willing to vaccinate. And that's what we've seen, is we are starting to see emerge more reluctance to vaccinate among conservatives than among liberals. So that is certainly something that many are concerned about, and it could lead to different vaccination rates in different states across the country.
So having said that, and back to the thing about how do we educate people about vaccinations? You talked about messengers and messages. One of the things that I have tried with people is introducing them to the National Library of Medicine, or PubMed.org, which is the National Library of Medicine. Is online, readily accessible, I think over 10,000 life sciences journal. And all you have to do is type in things like COVID vaccination efficacy, and all these articles will pop up. And so I've encouraged people to educate themselves. I say the information's there. If you're really concerned about this, see what really is the problem. Is that an appropriate approach?
I think it's an appropriate approach for some. I mean, I think the important thing to realize is that medical journals can be a bit jargony and a bit hard to follow for some, and especially once you start getting into the virology and molecular and cellular biology. If you don't have a degree in it, it can be tricky, right? You know, I studied the social side of vaccination, and I have an undergraduate degree in molecular and cellular biology, and it can still be a bit difficult to follow some of that literature. Now, some of it's very accessible, other pieces are not. So for certain segments of the population, that's exactly what they need, because they can spend the time, do their homework, and try to understand the articles. But for others, it might be a bit of a slog for them to try and do that themselves. So, you know, for them, you know, telling them to listen to other individuals that they trust in their lives who might actually have more capacity to do exactly what you're saying could also work.
So along that lines, one of my concerns, and one of the things that I see start to happening, is that if we have a large percentage of people who refuse to get vaccinated, what do we do then? Because we haven't reached herd immunity. And should there be a policy in place about everyone getting vaccinated? Now, I know with the exemptions that these vaccines have been made accessible, we can't force people to get vaccinated. But I know that there are some universities that are now saying that all their students have to be vaccinated before they can come back in the fall term. Is that something that we as a society are going to have to look at to actually reach herd immunity if there's a large amount of vaccine hesitancy out there? Or are there other approaches to get to that? I mean, after all, most of the time now, at least here at Texas A&M, students have to show that they've been immunized a whole host of diseases. Why wouldn't COVID-19 be one of those?
Yeah, so we're starting to see at the university level, several universities like Notre Dame and Rutgers announce to their students that they're going to have to be vaccinated to come back in the fall. And what I think is very likely is you're going to see different policies emerge from different universities, different states, and different municipalities. You know, I think more conservative states, like here in Texas, might be a less willing to put some sort of mandate in place. And frankly, anytime a mandate is put in place, there's a very real chance that it could lead to court cases, and this could be something that gets pushed towards the courts. Now, the court has traditionally sided with public health over you know, its history. There's even a very famous Supreme Court case, but from over 100 years ago, called Jacobson v. Massachusetts, which ties back to the idea of vaccinating, and that a state can mandate you to vaccinate. And the basic idea out of that case was related to smallpox and a pastor who didn't want to vaccinate. And the idea that came out of that case was, yes, the state can fine you if you choose not to vaccinate and mandate that you be vaccinated, but they can't forcibly vaccinate you, right? That's where the court landed, you know, well over 100 years ago. But the question is now, would the court come to a similar conclusion? And we really don't know the answer to that. The other thing that really complicates mandates related to vaccines right now is that technically the vaccines that are approved for use are only approved for emergency use authorization, right? They have not reached that final stage where they are approved for long-term use outside this emergency use context. And many have argued that it would be unfair and inappropriate to mandate a vaccine that is only approved for emergency use, right? Others have come out and said, well, that's ridiculous. We need to do this so we can get back to normal. But many have made that argument that as long as we're at this sort of intermediate emergency use phase, it is inappropriate to mandate.
Yeah, I think that's going to be an interesting question for people to watch as we go forward, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, now one of the things that you have mentioned in some of your interviews is that African Americans are significantly more likely to refuse vaccinations due to distrust of the medical establishment. So, what can we do or what can be done, I guess, to increase trust to help those individuals understand why they need to be vaccinated? Or is this just a continuing part of the messenger and messages um, scenario that you talked about earlier?
Yeah, so early in the pandemic, research by myself and many others found that African Americans were significantly less willing to vaccinate than white Americans. And this is a big concern because we know that African Americans are significantly more likely to contract COVID-19, to be hospitalized, and to die compared to white Americans. And because of that, it raised a lot of alarm bells and led individuals to really start pushing to change this among the African American community. The Biden administration invested a large sum of money in efforts towards this, and in particular, religious leaders in the African American community took it upon themselves to really focus on this. And what we've seen is that many in the African American community have moved from sort of the wait and see camp. They didn't want to be among the first to vaccinate towards vaccinating. So we've compared to some other hesitant groups, we've actually seen some pretty encouraging progress in that community. Now that said, African Americans still are more likely to be vaccine hesitant than other groups, even with the efforts that have been made so far. And there's good reasons for that. There's sort of historical reasons as well as contemporary reasons for African Americans to be mistrusting of the medical establishment, right? Historically, you could point to past medical abuses against African Americans. One that regularly gets pointed out in the media is the Tuskegee syphilis study, in which the United States government, tracked untreated syphilis in African American men for decades without ever telling them that they had syphilis, right? And didn't provide them the appropriate medical care that they thought. And it was something that went on for decades and led to the Clinton administration actually apologizing for it. But there's still a legacy there. But what I think the media misses is, I think the media sometimes naively says, well, African Americans don't want to get vaccinated because of what happened in the Tuskegee syphilis study. And I think that's sort of a naive view, because for many African Americans, there's more contemporary reasons for them to be not trusting in the medical establishment. To this day, African American complaints of pain are less likely to be taken seriously. African Americans with substance use disorder are less likely to get high quality medical assisted treatment compared to their white counterparts. African American maternal mortality is far higher than among whites. There's lots of contemporary reasons for them to be less trusting of the medical establishment, and not just the historical reasons. So, yes, it is a very real concern. The good news is that the individuals who have been pushing to address this have made some progress, pushing more African Americans towards vaccinating, but it is still something we need to be paying close attention to in the months ahead.
Well, and I think that as we draw close to the end of the podcast here, I think one of the things that bears talking about briefly is that COVID's not going to go away. At least everything I've read seems to suggest that this virus is going to be with us forever. And so if someone decides not to be vaccinated, they have to figure out how are they going to prevent themselves and their loved ones from getting infected with COVID, because it can have a lot of nasty side effects from that. I mean, how do you answer that when someone says, well, how if you don't get vaccinated, how are you going to deal with COVID?
Right, and the most fascinating piece of that is, if everyone chose to get vaccinated, we might have a chance of not having COVID with us forever, right? But to the extent that some segment of the public is going to choose not to vaccinate, it almost guarantees that we're going to have a COVID season every year, just like we have a flu season in the long run, right? And they'll probably be happening at the same time on top of each other. And if you've already been vaccinated in the past, you have some level of protection. You might need to get booster shots, just like you get a flu shot every year. You might need to get a COVID shot every year, every few years. But if you don't have any of that protection, you are at considerable risk. And the reality is, you're going to be at considerable risk from the strains that develop over time, which are going to be likely better at evading the defenses that the body has to protect itself, right? So it's potentially a real concern over time, because you might say, I'm not going to make the decision to vaccinate here in 2021, but if COVID's still with us in 2025 or 2027 and you're still not vaccinated, at a certain point, just sheer probability, there's a chance you're going to run across COVID and might get COVID, right? So, the safest thing for everyone to do is to get vaccinated when it is their turn to get vaccinated. And once they've been told that it is a safe and effective thing for them to do by individuals that they trust.
Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Callaghan. Regular listeners of our podcast know that at the end of the podcast, we always give our speakers a chance to give us their take-home message. So, Tim, if there was going to be any one thing you wanted people to remember from this podcast, what would that be?
Yeah, I think the most important thing for people to take away is that if you have not been vaccinated yet, vaccination is safe and effective and is absolutely something you should do to protect yourself and those you love. And if you've been vaccinated, but people in your life have not yet been vaccinated, do what you can to serve as that trusted individual to tell individuals about your own experience, why you chose to get vaccinated, and be honest with them. Tell them about any side effects you experienced, and what you feel comfortable doing now that you're vaccinated, because that could help to encourage those loved ones in your life to get vaccinated as well, so we can get this pandemic over with and get back to normal life.
Fabulous. Dr. Callaghan, again, thank you for being with us. And if any of you are watching John Oliver here in the next few weeks, and if you see Dr. Callaghan on it, you know where you saw him first.
Yeah, well, at least my research, for sure.
And again, I want to thank all of you for tuning in and watching the podcast today. Here at the Huffines, we are currently trying to give you the information you need to make smart decisions about your life and your health and your exercise. So continue to watch your feed, your podcast feed, for more podcasts from us. And until next time, we hope that you stay active and healthy.